The sun sank slowly behind the jagged tips of the fir trees, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised plums. The group of 5 friends, Mark, Elena, Alex, Igor, and Vicky, had finally reached Dead Man's Hollow, a deep clearing shrouded by a forest so dense that even midday felt like twilight. Despite the grim name, the mood was electric. Alex and Vicky, celebrating their anniversary, were inseparable. They shared soft glances and private jokes, wrapped in the invincible glow of a couple deeply in love. "This spot is legendary," Igor shouted, dropping his heavy rucksack with a dull thud. "Not a bar of signal for miles, just us and the void. Perfect." They moved with practiced efficiency, pitching 3 tents in a tight semicircle around what would become their communal fire. As the girls unrolled sleeping bags, the guys joked about local bears, though the silence of the woods felt strangely sterile. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. As the shadows stretched and fused into a single suffocating darkness, the temperature plummeted. "We need more fuel," Mark noted, squinting into the black void between the trunks. "That small pile we gathered on the way won't last until midnight. Igor, Elena, let's head back a bit deeper. I saw some dry fallen cedar a few hundred yards back." "What about us?" Alex asked, his arm draped protectively around Vicky's shoulders. "You two are the newlyweds," Igor teased with a wink. "Stay here and guard the fortress. Get the small fire going and prep the tea. We'll be back before the embers die." The trio vanished into the tree line, their flashlights carving weak, shaky tunnels into the gloom until even the sound of their snapping twigs faded. Alex and Vicky sat by the tiny flickering flame, the orange light dancing across their faces. They laughed about summer plans, but Vicky suddenly went rigid. She gripped Alex's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. From the direction of their tent, just beyond the reach of the firelight, came a sound. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sound of dry, papery skin dragging slowly across synthetic fabric. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling, "did you hear that?"
Alex froze, his eyes scanning the periphery of the firelight. "It's probably just the wind shifting the fly sheet, Vic. Or a branch." "There is no wind," she countered, her voice barely audible. He stood up, grabbing a heavy flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the side of their blue tent. For a second, everything looked normal. Then the fabric flexed. A depression appeared from the outside, as if someone were pressing a palm against the nylon. Slowly, the pressure increased, and as the light hit the angle just right, they saw it. A handprint. But it wasn't human. The fingers were impossibly long, 5 elongated, needle-thin digits that reached from the top of the tent halfway to the ground. Then another appeared, and another. They were pale, oily marks that seemed to glow with a faint, sickly phosphorescence against the dark fabric. "Hey, who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. "Mark? Igor? This isn't funny." No answer. Only the rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch of those long fingers roaming the tent's surface, searching for an opening. The fire suddenly hissed and died down to a dull, angry red glow, as if the air itself had become too thick to burn. "I'm going out there," whispered Alex, his face set in a mask of terrified bravado. "They're messing with us. I'm going to catch them." "Alex, no! Stay inside the light!" Vicky sobbed, clutching his jacket. "I'll be 2 seconds. I have the knife." He stepped out of the small circle of warmth. The moment his boots hit the grass beyond the fire, the forest went deathly silent. Not even the wind dared to breathe. Vicky watched his silhouette move toward the back of the tent. "Alex?" There was no struggle, no epic fight, just a wet, sickening thud, the sound of a heavy weight hitting the earth. Then a sharp, metallic snap. Vicky screamed, a raw, jagged sound that tore through the trees. She waited for him to shout back, to tell her it was a joke. but the only response was a soft, wet dragging sound moving away into the brush. Then silence. Total, crushing silence. 10 minutes later, 3 flashlights flickered in the distance. "Vic! Alex! We heard a scream!" Igor's voice called out as the trio came running into the clearing, their arms laden with wood. They found Vicky collapsed by the dying embers, staring blankly at the tent. The tent wasn't blue anymore. It was covered in hundreds of those long, pale handprints, overlapping like scales. And Alex was gone.
"Vicky, where is he?" Mark dropped his bundle of wood, the logs thudding like falling bodies. Vicky didn't speak. She only pointed a trembling finger at the back of the tent. Igor swung his high-powered tactical light toward the spot. The beam hit the mud, revealing a dark, viscous trail that looked like spilled oil, leading straight into the dense thicket of thorns. Beside it lay Alex's flashlight, its lens shattered, pulsing a dying, rhythmic flicker. "Alex, this isn't funny, man!" Igor roared, but his voice lacked conviction. He stepped toward the trail, then stopped. "The handprints! Mark, look at the tent!" The pale, oily marks weren't just on the fabric anymore. They were appearing on the tree trunks, higher and higher up, as if something had climbed into the canopy without shaking a single leaf. "We have to go, now," Elena whispered. Her eyes darted toward the darkness above. "Forget the gear, just the car keys. Mark, where are the keys?" Mark reached into his pocket, his face paling. They were in the bag, in the tent. A sudden wet slap sounded from directly above them. They looked up. Dangling from a thick pine branch 30 feet up was a shape that defied anatomy. It looked like a knot of pale, translucent limbs, too many joints, too many fingers, tightly wound together like a ball of pale yarn. It had no discernible head, just a wet, pulsing slit in the center of its torso that whistled with every breath. As their lights hit it, the creature unfurled. It didn't fall. It descended with a sickening fluidity, its limbs stretching like warm wax. It was gray-white, the color of a drowned moon, and its skin was covered in the same phosphorescent oil that stained the tent. It moved not like an animal, but like a puppet being lowered by invisible strings. "Run!" Mark screamed. They scrambled toward the trail, but the forest had changed. The path they had used an hour ago was gone, replaced by a wall of thorns that seemed to have grown overnight. As they turned to find another way, a branch snapped behind them. They spun around. Elena was gone. No scream, no struggle, just an empty space where she had stood a second before. High above, they heard a soft, melodic chirp, followed by the sound of something heavy being pulled through the needles of the pines. "Elena!" Mark's voice was a jagged shard of glass. He swung his light upward, but the beam only caught the swaying of a high branch and a single, lonely hiking boot falling through the needles, hitting the forest floor with a dull, final thud. The 3 survivors, Mark, Igor, and Vicky, didn't wait. They bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through dead brush that clawed at their skin like fingernails. The forest had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows. Every tree looked like a limb. Every rustle of the wind sounded like that wet, papery dragging. "In there!" Igor gasped, pointing to a massive, lightning-scarred oak with a hollowed-out trunk. It was a natural cathedral of rotting wood, large enough to shield them from whatever was hunting from the canopy. They scrambled into the cramped, dark space, pressing their backs against the damp inner walls. Igor kept his light off to avoid being a beacon. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of 3 hearts. "It's not an animal," Vicky whispered, her voice dead and hollow. It's a weaver. Did you see the fingers? It wasn't killing them. It was collecting them." "Shut up, Vicky," Mark hissed, though his hands were shaking so hard he dropped his flashlight. It rolled to the center of the hollow, clicking on as it hit the ground. The floor of the hollow was paved with bone-white calcified handprints, thousands of them, layered over each other like scales. And as the light traveled upward, they saw the walls weren't just wood. They were lined with thin, translucent silk, and behind the silk, silhouettes were pressed against the bark. Igor reached out, his hand trembling, and ripped a small section of the webbing. A face stared back. It was Alex. His eyes were wide, glazed with a milky film, his mouth sewn shut with that same glowing, oily thread. He wasn't dead. His chest moved in a slow, agonizingly shallow rhythm. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of husks, some old and gray, some fresh, were woven into the very structure of the tree. A soft, melodic whistle echoed from the opening of the hollow. The weaver didn't climb in, it simply reached. One long, multi-jointed arm, pale as a maggot, slid around the edge of the trunk. Then another. The limbs began to knit together across the entrance, weaving a frantic, shimmering lattice of silk, sealing them inside the larder. The silk hardened within seconds, turning from a wet slime into a substance as cold and rigid as iron. The three of them were trapped in a tomb of living faces. Igor began to kick at the entrance, but every strike was absorbed by the webbing with a sickening, fleshy vibration. From the shadows of the hollow ceiling, the weaver finally fully revealed its shape. It didn't just have limbs, it was a colonial organism of reaching parts. As it squeezed through the narrow gaps of its own web, its body folded and snapped, ribs clicking like a deck of cards. It had no face, only a translucent membrane through which they could see the stolen jewelry of its previous victims, watches, rings, and a pair of glasses swirling in a digestive fluid. "Igor, the lighter!" Mark screamed. Igor fumbled for his torch, flicking the flint. A small flame bloomed. The weaver recoiled, its multi-jointed limbs clicking in a frantic rhythmic sequence, the sound of 1,000 typewriters. But as the heat hit the silk walls, something terrible happened. The silk didn't just melt, it screamed. The trapped husks, including the one that looked like Alex, began to convulse as the fire consumed the webbing that was now part of their nervous systems. In the chaos, the creature changed tactics. It didn't strike, it exploded into a cloud of those pale, oily handprints. They weren't just marks, they were parasites. Thousands of tiny, hand-shaped spores filled the air, sticking to Mark's skin, then Igor's. Mark clawed at his arm, but the handprint was already sinking beneath his flesh, the pale fingers visible under his skin, moving toward his throat. "Vicky, run!" Mark gasped, his voice turning into that same wet whistle they had heard in the trees. His jaw began to elongate, his joints snapping loudly as his body was forced into a new, impossible geometry. He was being woven from the inside out. Vicky, fueled by a primal terror that bypassed grief, threw herself at the burning section of the web. The heat scorched her hair, and the silk tore at her skin, but she burst through into the cold night air. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned like lye. She reached the road, stumbling into the path of a passing ranger's truck. When the authorities returned to Dead Man's Hollow the next morning, they found nothing. No tents, no fire pit, and no ancient oak tree. There was only a wide, circular patch of ground where the grass had turned white and brittle. Vicky was placed in a psychiatric ward, silent and unmoving. It was only a week later that the nurses noticed something strange. On the back of her hospital gown, between her shoulder blades where she couldn't reach, a single, pale, oily handprint had begun to appear. And from the vent in the ceiling, a soft, melodic whistle began to echo.